Hi guys. Today I wanted to do a book review on this book, The World Peace Diet by Will Tuttle, Ph.D. Um, this is a really interesting book. I really recommend it. I feel like when you first see the title of this, you kind of think this is going to be like some crazy um, kind of like a raw food book that isn't really good advice or something, but this is actually a book full of ideas and philosophy about veganism that is really gonna just like bring everything you've been thinking about. Okay, it's like once you start being vegan, you start and you have this sort of like profound realization that animals are just like us. Kind of, it always makes me think of Us Weekly when I say that, like stars are just like us. But when you realize that animals have every right to live and live their own lives, and that what we're doing to them is like crazy. Once you have that realization on like a gut level and you really believe it and understand it, which happened to me by watching like Toronto Pig Saves videos. So yeah, once you have that realization, like if you're like me, you start seeing the world completely differently. And like for me, I started just seeing like the place where I lived as differently. Like I just like walking around, I just saw the city differently. I just wanted to be more connected to nature, and I kind of had this desire for like sort of like a return to nature and like a return to the Garden of Eden or something. And yeah, so yeah, I just started having all these thoughts, or like watching commercials on TV for fast food, or just like a weight loss pill. You just start looking at it and you're like, wow, I can't believe that I used to be so brainwashed that this seemed completely normal, because now I see this as like completely crazy conspiracy going on, like lying to the masses. So yeah, those are just two examples of like different thoughts I've had ever since becoming vegan. Um, but this book like has so many different ideas about those kinds of thoughts. Like honestly, it's sort of like, you just are starting to have the inklings of thoughts, but this guy has thought about things so much that he has these fully formed, fleshed out ideas about um, the things you've kind of been like barely trying to put words to. And it's really, really interesting for any for any person who's thinking about these things. Like I was really fascinated by it. I'm like, whoa, this is interesting. I can't really explain it. It's kind of like if you meet someone and they're like fascinating and they just have like tons of ideas, and they'll talk to you about like really interesting philosophical things that you never had even thought of. It's a really fascinating book. And it's almost like a little far-fetched at times, but it's really fun to think about. Like he has this whole vision of a different world, like a vegan world. And a lot of times people talk about that, like, I'm trying to make the world a better place for animals and people, but like he really believes that it's not only possible, but he makes this really convincing argument that life, it's the way we started out and where we have to get back to. And that's one of the main ideas of his book. And it's interesting because, like, as I said, how when I became vegan, I started feeling this like longing for more natural things and living in nature. and living at peace, in peace and harmony with animals. Well, like one of the main ideas of his book is that when the world was young, or like in ancient cultures, we used to live in this Garden of Eden like culture where we lived in fertile valleys like by the river, and we ate plants only, and we gardened and just like grew our own fruits and vegetables in the fertile soil of the valleys. And you might have heard of like this whole goddess cult or like goddess religions, like we worship the feminine, and that's why we'll see all these ancient fertility statues of like a really large woman. And I've kind of read a little about that, and people thought, since women gave birth, and people didn't really understand how or why in that time, so they thought women were magical, and so they were revered as the goddess. And yeah, so I just imagine this really like awesome place where we were just like swimming in the river and eating. We were like fruitarian. We ate plants that we grew, and we were very like like we didn't make war with anyone. We were very peaceful. The feminine was revered, so women were like goddesses, and there was no sexism, or maybe there was reverse sexism, because like women were the best. And like I always think like fat women were revered. I think that's nice because of like fat shaming in our culture. Like the fertility statues are always like very large, but that was a symbol of like, I don't know, maybe just having so much fruit that you could get fat, which is really hard to do on a fruitarian lifestyle. Anyway, so that's how we were. Then all of a sudden these warring tribes came in, and this is like the root of his, like this is the main idea of the book. They started capturing wild animals and putting them in pens, and they were shepherds, and he calls this the herding culture. And one by one they started like enslaving, or otherwise like putting animals in fences and killing them off one by one for food, and eating meat. So they were the first people who started eating meat. And that is like, he thinks, the cause of violence in our culture then and today. Because he thinks that as soon as they started feeling it was okay to enslave and kill animals, they began becoming desensitized to violence, and they kind of became a violent people, and they invaded the goddess religions, the fruitarian, peace-loving people who were not violent and never made war, and they like conquered their culture, and they started forcing everyone, or they got everyone like addicted to eating meat. They toppled the goddess idol or statues, and they instated God as man as we know him today, and they became like a very violent people. And he says that herding culture, as he calls it, is exactly the same culture we live in today, except the herds are now, enclosed in factory farms or farms like far from our view. But it's the idea that we still keep these herds of animals and one by one, kill them off to eat them. That is like this, he gives this idea of this Jungian archetype of the shadow. And it's like this concept that whatever we repress, like, comes back to like haunt us in a way. So he says like this herding culture, like the fact that we still keep and kill animals is like our shadow, and it keeps us violent, and it keeps like violence alive in the world, and it makes us a violent culture, and it keeps women, like it's the same ideology that like dominates women and the feminine, and basically like it's the root of all our problems. And like one really interesting thing he says is that, and this is what I believe, like the fact that we do this to animals, it's just like we just have to accept it. Like humans have a dark side, and this is like the expression of that. But he's like, no, we don't. And the fact that we do this to animal is what causes our dark side and the violent impulses in our nature. And that, I mean, that's, I don't know if I agree, but it's really interesting. He's like, a peaceful world is more than possible, and if we just like exposed our herding culture that is so like we grow up with it, it's just a given. But if we stop taking it as a given and we expose this and help people to have these you know like spiritual realizations, like I had just by watching Toronto Pig Saves videos, like looking in the eyes of animals, we could really change the world. And yeah, like another interesting thing he says is that Jesus was a vegetarian, and that there's this whole book about it that he talks about, but that um, are his teachings of vegetarianism and love for all living creatures were suppressed, because veganism and vegetarian, like it's been there throughout the ages, like the centuries, but it's always been repressed because it's so controversial. And I think not only is it controversial because like people like me, like it's not that simple. It's like this idea could just upend our whole culture and bring us back to a totally different, more peaceful way of life, like a more natural way of life. And it's like this herding culture, these like dominating people in charge, they want to keep us violent, and they want to be in power. And this whole idea of like this peaceful vegetarian goddess worshipping women loving world is like a threat. And so it's a bigger threat to our culture than people even realize. So that's just really like touching on the one of the main ideas in this book. I find that really interesting because although it seems kind of far-fetched, it makes actually a lot of sense. And he talks about the ways that, you know, it's really interesting, like, ways that the drug companies and the meat companies tried to suppress, like, this idea of veganism. It's just like crazy, but it's really threatening because it's really important. I mean, people say like, what do you want most? World peace. It's like, in his view, this could actually bring world peace, but his idea is that people don't want, well, the people, our culture is like the like we're a violent culture, and that's what they want. So, I don't know. It's really interesting, and there's so much more I could say about it. But yeah, it's just full of like really cool ideas. I really recommend it. And if you've read it, I'd love to hear what you think. Yeah, but I think like every single vegan who's interested in veganism really needs to read this book, because it will just, I mean, if you don't agree completely with everything he says, like maybe you think humans are naturally violent and you don't believe that there actually were like goddess cults that worship the feminine, because I know that's controversial. it's just really interesting to see like where these ideas could go if you really looked into them enough. So sorry if that wasn't the most articulate discussion, because I actually have a lot of trouble talking to a computer. So yeah, I'm getting used to that with my YouTube videos, but that's actually one of my weaknesses. So yeah, but anyway, the World Peace Diet, I really recommend it. And let me know what you think, or if this video made sense at all. So